What's the simplest difference between gene and allele? What's the simplest difference between gene and allele? Now let's look here. This is a single chromosome. This is the same thing. What you see here is exactly what you see here. Okay, these are not two chromosomes. These are not two chromosomes. This is one chromosome, but it has duplicated. So now we have two chromatids, sister chromatids, making up this one single chromosome. And chromosomes have segments, or have segments like this on them. The two chromatids have segments on them. So we know that genes are segments on these chromosomes. So this is a gene. Let's say this gene codes for height. This other gene may code for eye color. This other gene may code for hair color. Now in this case, we are talking about human. Okay, so each of these segments are genes, right? What is now an allele? What is an allele then? Now, if we have this gene, remember in humans, these genes come in pair, which means we have two copies for each of these genes. So let's say height here. Let's say we have genes that code for height. Let's say we have HH, dominant. Okay, these two codes for height. Or let's have it heterozygous, so that will explain better. There's a big H, small h. This is the gene that codes for height. Okay, now this gene has two copies, this and this. So each of these two copies is called an allele. So an allele is one gene in a pair. So we have a pair here, HH. So each of these is what we call an allele. This is an allele. This is also an allele. So one copy of the two copies of the genes is called an allele. So we can also say that it is an alternate version of the gene. So we see, for example, here we have big H and small h. This is an allele, this is an allele. So this becomes a version of this gene. This also becomes a version of this gene. So one of these two here is called an allele. So these are genes. Genes come in pairs. So here now we have, let's use this height again to explain. So we could have the big H here for height. And then on this other chromatid, we have the small h. So you see the two alleles there of the same gene, height, that codes for height. So let's say this is eye color, let's use E. We can say, okay, this is gene E, big E, and then this one is small e. The two copies code for the same trait, which is height, but they have two copies of this gene. So one of the two copies is called an allele. But when there are two, they are the gene that are responsible for eye color, right? But just one copy is an allele. So that is the simple difference between gene and allele. So if you have a gene like AA, this is a gene. So one of this copy here is an allele. This other one is also an allele. So we can say that two or more alleles make up the gene. So even an allele is a gene. An allele is also a gene. But the difference is an allele is just one copy of that gene, or we can say a version of that gene, a particular version of that gene. So because another thing for us to note here is, because they code for the same trait, which is height, they do not code for the same proteins. That is one thing we need to know. They do not code for the same proteins. In as much as they code for the same traits, they are responsible for the same trait, they do not code for the same proteins. For example, we know that we use the big letter to represent the dominant character, and we use the small letter to represent the recessive character. Let's say this big one is for tall height, and this one is for short height, right? Okay, you see now, this particular, if an individual has this particular gene for tall height, and remember, during meiosis, we can only receive just one copy. just one copy. So let's say the individual receives this big H, which is the tall height. So that individual is going to express the tall height. So if the individual received the small h, the individual is going to express the short height, right? So you see, the protein that codes for tall height is different from the protein that codes for short height, but they both code for the same trait, which is height. But either tall or short depends on the type of protein that is being produced, and these two alleles may code for different proteins. So they are responsible for the same trait, height, but they may code for different proteins. That is why we say that an allele is an alternate version. So if this gene is for tall height, the other version of it will code for short height. So it's an alternate version of the particular gene that we are looking at.